Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. This is the second time I've given a talk at one of these meetings. First time in Melbourne, and it's a pleasure to come so far south and find so many people who are interested in innovation. I guess if we were in Antarctica, we'd even find some people interested in innovation. Some of you might know that in Antarctica they've drilled a cubic kilometer of ice and filled it up with detectors. It's called the IceCube. That is the name of the scientific experiment. And that particular scientific experiment is detecting neutrinos from the center of the Earth. And it's trying to find out whether the rate of neutrino production is sufficiently large for us to know what's actually going on at the center of the Earth, which is apparently important to the future of humankind. So there's intellectual activity now well established in Antarctica, which means that as we move gradually north to Melbourne, this will be a hotbed of innovation. As we go past Sydney, we'll be looking at changing the planet and introducing innovations right around the world. By the time you get to Brisbane, it's all slowing down a bit. That's just a random story. But I wanted to talk to you today about the failure of my career, essentially, because I learned research management in the late 1980s when the patent was going to trump everything, and we wanted to use patents extensively to make large amounts of money for research organizations like ANSTO, like CSIRO and others. And we were going to largely become independent of government funding by using the mechanism of creating intellectual property. Now I've got to point this, so there we go, whoops. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and so many public research organizations are still highly dependent on government funding. This is an interesting example of the pre-patent era, and is a wonderful type of sailing vessel called the Fleet. Now, this was invented in the 15th and 16th century and allowed the Dutch to colonize large parts of the world, because it became a standard design which was very easy to build, didn't fall over and sink too often, and really allowed them to distinguish themselves from the rest of the world. It was really the cell phone of the era, because this was the basic standard of communication and getting things done at that time. Now, that was based on an open innovation model, because no one attempted to control the intellectual property of building this type of ship. And because it became generally available as a standard design, it allowed a massive acceleration of the exploration from a European perspective of the rest of the world, and the meeting of Europeans for the first time by other parts of the world. And of course, at that time and moving into the 19th century, there were all sorts of innovations which have had a profound effect on our ability to do what we do and to communicate. Leon Silk is not one of my favorites, but it's still made in pretty much the same way today. That led to a massive expansion of people wanting to pay more for clothing, which is apparently still popular. I try to avoid that. Millwrights with wind power adoption. This is the first wind power generation. The second wind power generation, of course, started in 1884. When an American made the first electrical system from wind power generation. He did this in his backyard. In fact, it was the park across the road from his backyard, and ran his house on batteries plus wind power for 20 years. So that's a relatively old technology now. You get the high-pressure steam engine. Civil engineers are an interesting bunch. They haven't patented much at all over the generations that they've done civil engineering. And they tend to give away their technologies, because that's the way you can advance your career in civil engineering. You go and build a bridge somewhere else, and you take your technology with you. And so it is a non-patent based intellectual property system. And of course, cotton and textiles. So for a large part of the Industrial Revolution, there was in fact no patent system that underpinned a large amount of the innovation. In fact, open innovation in that sense is rather old. In the modern era, those of you who know these particular acronyms, if you don't scribble them down and look them up on Wikipedia, the first one, GSM, changed its name to the Global System for Mobile, and that underpins the so-called second generation of mobile phone. 3GPP is doing the new generation that we currently have of third generation cell phones and is moving into the fourth generation of cell phones. The interesting thing about these consortia is that these organizations specifically did not try to control the intellectual property. The GSM standard was set up by a European standards body in order to set the playing field level for everybody else to compete effectively. And they invented some very important principles. The first one was called RAND, R-A-N-D, which is reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing. And it was based on the idea that there'd be so much IP in the average cell phone that if you didn't have a RAND approach, everybody would ask for too much in license fees. And so they invented a set of principles that actually reduced the cost of the intellectual property in the cell phones, which is why we can basically get given them these days, more or less, and we use them so extensively. As we got into 3GPP, they basically extended that concept to call it FRAND, and they added the word fair in front, so that there's a notion of fairness with intellectual property in the same sentence. And so what we see in the communications protocols now is an attempt to offset the power of patents in order to maximize the utility of intellectual property for those of us who are users. Has anybody got any sense of how many patents there are in the average cell phone today? Anybody looked at it recently? I think it's of the order of just over 1,000 patents in your cell phone, and everybody's got to get their slice of that pie. And you don't get your slice of that pie if it's not really well orchestrated, usually by lawyers in London who get paid a lot of money for that. So I just want a brief introduction then to the other half of the equation, which is patenting. And you can see from about 1840 into 1850, when they first set up the Intellectual Property Office in the United States, you can see that up until 1920, about 60,000 patents a year. That's still quite a good number. The Wright brothers patented the aeroplane. They never made a huge amount of money out of those patents. We know Alexander Graham Bell. You can see then as we go through the 30s, 40s, right up to 1998, massive increase in the number of patents up to 160,000. Now the reason this stops in 1998 is somebody wrote a book called Rembrandt's in the Attic, which we were all forced to read in 1997 and 1998 when it was published, which explained how you had to go and mine your own company for its intellectual property because you had stuff in the intellectual property case in your organization, and by mining that, you're going to make a lot of money. Well, again, most organizations didn't make enough money out of that, and so that paradigm didn't work either. But just a question for you, if there were about 160,000 patents in 1998, how many patents were issued last year, 2011, in the United States Patent Office? Anybody got a sort of order of magnitude number? I've got the answer here, fortunately. 2011, 247,713. So we're about to get 250,000 new patents every year out of the United States Patent Office. That's a massive number. Now, about 1 in 100 of those patents makes money. About 10 out of 100 break even, and all of the rest don't make any money at all. So this is sound and secure evidence that the intellectual property system globally is still highly dependent on the patent and will be probably for the future. But as I've already indicated, the patent is now layered up in all sorts of licensing arrangements, if you want to make large amounts of money, that slice and dice those patents into very, very small segments of the total intellectual property package for global businesses. And I'm thinking mainly of global businesses here. So it's possible that this year the magical 250,000 will be broken. Now, how many of those are Australian patents? Anybody got an idea of how many US patents Australia secures every year? I think it's of the order of about 600, isn't it? So our ability to impact the global knowledge system through the utility of patents is actually quite low. And therefore, we have to have much smarter strategies than that in order to be successful. We've heard from Damien about Henry Chesbrough. Companies will quickly recognize ideas that fit the pattern that has proved successful for them before, but they will struggle with ideas that require a very different configuration of assets, resources, and positions to be successful. In fact, companies are probably not anymore the basic unit of innovation. It's groups of companies, it's groups of organizations that organize themselves into some sort of an ecosystem is one of the words that is used. This is reinforced by Peter Meyer, who said patents are not universally important to innovation, as many as there are. And you think of the massive investment. I don't know if you've ever secured a patent and how much it costs. You multiply the cost of getting a patent by 250,000 a year. You're talking about very large sums of money invested in that system. Now, patents in the biotech sector have got a sort of mixed reviews. This is from Murawski's work in the book ScienceMart. And you can see here the number of new biotech entities coming out and the relatively small number of those that are based on licenses. Because in fact, in the biology space, the utility of patents is quite questionable in many cases. And so what we're seeing in different parts of the innovation landscape is new modes of interaction developing and new ways of doing things. I was talking to someone just before we came in about the whole area of introducing new entities into the pharmaceutical mix at the moment. And one of the big changes that has happened since the days of large pharma and the massive pipelines that large pharma used to have is the growth of these so-called CROs, contract research organizations. Unfortunately, the same word was used in the 90s to describe organizations like CSIRO and so on, but they don't mean this sort of organization. This is an organization that is designed specifically to de-risk the pipeline for putting new pharmaceutical entities into the marketplace. And you can see the billions of dollars that are coming into these contract research organizations. And really what they've done is they've fragmented the value chain. Some of them concentrate on acquiring patients who are going to undergo the drug trial. Some of them focus on all of the quality controls that are required in order to get an FDA approval. Others focus on crunching the data and making sure that is done accurately. Now, in the Australian setting at the moment, we don't yet have a lot of CROs. They're starting to emerge now. And I would say it's highly timely that we get some of these going, because this is the way, in fact, to de-risk the pharmaceutical supply pipeline. And small countries, in my view, have to find ways of doing this very, very effectively. If this is a requirement in an economy like the United States, which is really, really big and has got a lot of capability, you can imagine how much more important it is to have this type of fragmented but highly organized type of pipeline available to us. This is an example of open innovation which has been flying below the radar, because everybody has to make money in this model. Nobody can lose money like large pharma used to lose it on so many entities, and it's got to work really, really well. Now, many large companies like BASF, for example, have joined the open innovation approach, and I think that we're going to see this more and more from large companies, and tend to have still what I call a quasi-pipeline view of how technology is developed. Now, I think this is interesting because large companies will always draw a pipeline. What small companies will draw is not a pipeline because they can't command the pipeline. They will draw a set of networks, a network diagram, a sociological system, rather than something that comes out of the industrial age, which is called a pipeline. So what is the new sociology of the open innovation system going to be like in Australia is a key question. Again, we're a relatively small knowledge system. We're a relatively small innovation system. We can't simply copy what large companies are doing, and we can't copy what large countries are doing. The other feature of the landscape that has changed dramatically is the whole area of scientific collaboration. I don't know if you've been tracking this, but the number of authors per paper has been going up quite significantly. In fact, it's increased by one extra person per paper in the last decade. On average, it's going to do that every decade. If you just discovered the Higgs boson, I don't know how many authors there are on that paper. And it's a really cool boson, by the way, and needs to be respected. So, you know, that's probably going to have, I reckon, on the core paper, about 1,679 authors to discover the Higgs boson. But only Higgs is going to get the Nobel Prize, or maybe one of the other guys as well. But collaboration is increasing the connectivity of the knowledge system And most of the new collaborations are taking place from larger countries or groups of countries to larger groups of countries. Where does that leave Australia? If you compare the collaboration dynamic, for example, between Sao Paulo in Brazil and Australia and the rest of the world, you'll be quite terrified at the rate at which Brazilian connections to the global knowledge system are increasing dramatically. Have we thought about what scientific collaboration looks like in the next generation? I hope I'm not making you nervous in any way. This is the sort of thing that only keeps me awake at night. But it's really important that we think about some of these things. So, yeah, there's a lot going on, and a lot is changing at the moment. And the trick is, as small countries, to be able to do something about it. And this is helped by Tim Berners-Lee, who was at the European Research Organization for Nuclear Research, sometimes called CERN. And he invented the World Wide Web. Why did he invent the World Wide Web? Well, he wasn't thinking of us. He was thinking about the number of images that have to be exchanged between scientists. One of the reasons I find CERN fascinating is that it is a non-territorial jurisdiction. In other words, it's not in a country. If you go and visit CERN, you have to leave Switzerland, if you started in Switzerland, and go into CERN, and it's got a piece of property which is not in any country in the world, which is fascinating in itself. It means it can make up its own intellectual property laws, it's got its own police force, it's got its own sense of humor if you've spent any time there. And it was born in 1954 in Geneva, which means it's older than I am. But it's the world's largest particle physics research lab. It's got 20 European member states and 60 other countries that collaborate, including Australia, with some very strong groups here in Melbourne. And about 10,000 scientists are involved in CERN at any time. So they spend quite a lot of money, and basically under the ground, they've got a 27-kilometer tunnel that is full of that stuff, okay? All of that machinery was not designed by a company. It was designed by the people who work at and through and connected to CERN. So all of the intellectual property development that is undertaken there is sometimes done by companies, but all of the intellectual property is essentially free to the people who collaborate. So if you can go and mine CERN, so to speak, you can find awesome intellectual property. So they've got a very simple mission, push back the frontiers of knowledge, develop new technologies, train scientists and engineers of tomorrow, and unite people from different countries and cultures. I think that's quite a cool mission. And the things that they've developed completely dwarf in significance what some very large companies do. Right in the middle there is positron, it should be positron, not proton emission, positron emission tomography, PET. Positron emission tomography is used widely now globally. The first project was a sort of offline project between the University of Geneva and the people at CERN, which developed the first PET camera. Our colleagues from GE play a big role in PET these days. But that technology was developed without anybody controlling the core intellectual property. And so it has rapidly become pervasive globally because there was no attempt to limit the scale and the growth of that technology. Of course, the web, grid computing, hadron therapy, which is not available in Australia yet, was also mainly developed by people from CERN and a few other places in the world. And really all it is a bunch of people trying to smash things together in a 27-kilometer ring. That's their core mission. But out of that is spun technology after technology after technology, which I would argue has more profoundly changed the world than many of the technologies that are controlled in a simple way by patents, which means that the open innovation system has been working for generations. Australia, by the way, built some of the detectors that are in the Atlas detector, and the Atlas guys, in my view, beat the CMS guys to find the Higgs. So there's an Australian win there, at least for the team at Melbourne University. Hadron therapy, I want to say 2 words about. This is a new type of therapy where you use protons, or even better, carbon atoms. You accelerate them really, really fast in something called a synchrotron, in this case a proton or a hadron synchrotron. And then basically what you do is, if you've got, say, a tumor at the back of your eye, what carbon likes to do is it likes to go through everything without doing any damage. And then at a particular point it says, I'm tired, and it drops all its energy just in one tiny little spot. And so hadron therapy can be used for very, very precise treatment of very, very difficult tumors. There are probably, around the world every year, about 60 to 70,000 cancers that are highly treatable with this particular device. This is possibly the first generation of nuclear science and technology when Australia will not be a fast follower and adopt hadron therapy early. And that is because, as a small country, if you're not connected to what is going on globally, there is a risk that you can fall behind. But we formed a consortium of everybody who's interested in hadron therapy in Australia, and if you're interested, come talk to me afterwards, and we'll get it here as quickly as we can. Here is something, it is Australian, the very beautiful Australian synchrotron, which is here in Melbourne, and which is potentially the sort of place where hadron therapy, based on synchrotron technology, because this is also a synchrotron and hadron therapy is also used as synchrotrons, where we've got a template of how you build something that then can be used in medical care. So, same old story from Chesbrough. In a world of abundant knowledge, hoarding technology is a self-limiting strategy. Nor can any organization, even the largest, afford any longer to ignore the tremendous external pools of knowledge that exist. So my basic argument is that the only source of monopoly power these days is brands, not technology. The technology is becoming pervasive. The brands are really dominating it. I noticed that Samsung and some other player there have just had a big court case. Who knows where all that'll end. I think where we need to play is at the bottom of this diagram, where those of us who are in universities and research organizations try to creep along the bottom, bringing the new knowledge into Australia as efficiently as we possibly can. So, the open dynamic, it's reasserting itself after a generation of patenting. It's delivering value. It's globalizing. It requires scale. Can we do scale? How do we get scale? I think that this particular open season will start at a run, it'll slow to a walk, and it'll eventually stall because people will find out how to monopolize it. But I think we've got about 10 years to play. It's time to run, and then the next era of monopoly will emerge. Thank you.